Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. So last week, so you can place yourself in the space-time continuum. Last week, I was doing my occasional dip into the commentary podcast, John Podhoretz's, niche podcast, which has some really talented people on it who listen to him talk a lot. They had this guy, Jesse Arm, on from the Manhattan Institute talking about this new survey of the GOP. And I thought it was very, very interesting. And they weren't asking all the questions I wanted to ask, some of which I can't remember now. But I told my people, hopefully Jesse will remind me of what they are. I told my people we should have him on because they've done this big new study. It's called the New GOP Survey Analysis of Americans Overall, Today's Republican Coalition, and the Minorities of MAGA. Jesse is I can't even remember. I'm so tired if I said this already, but he is the Vice President for External Operations over at the Manhattan Institute, which my old friend and former NR colleague, Raihan Salam, is the president of, and I hear he rules with an iron fist. So Jesse, welcome to the Remnant.
Thank you for having me. It's really great to be on with you.
So, if you had a book, the question would be, what's your book about? But you don't have one. You have just merely a study. So, why don't you tell me, what's your study about in terms of, what are the what you see as the key takeaways that people should know about?
Well, hopefully soon I'll have a book, and maybe we'll talk again on the future, and there'll be something more to plug. But what the survey is about is that there has been a lot of talk in recent weeks about the American right and fractures within today's GOP. What does it mean to be MAGA? And can this coalition, this successful 2024 political coalition that President Trump put together, remain cohesive once he exits the stage? So we wanted to explore those questions. And in order to do that, the Manhattan Institute, where I oversee our government affairs, our communications work, but also a newer function where we're trying to put together a lot of public opinion and polling work, did a survey to explore this emerging multi-ethnic and working class GOP. We asked just under 3,000 voters, including large oversamples of Black and Hispanic Republicans or 2024 Trump voters, about a wide range of policy issues, their views on all topics. But we also went further than just policy. We asked about identity politics. We asked about populism. We asked about conspiracy theories. We asked point blank, are you an anti-Semite? Are you racist? And other kinds of questions that get at some of those themes. And the biggest takeaway is that two diverging camps emerged. Not necessarily the ones that we expected to or that we hear about all of the time in the discourse from sort of dissident figures on the online right or classic left of center figures in the corporate media. No, we saw that the GOP is navigating these generational and ideological tensions that cut across these old factional lines with differences in leadership, cultural priorities, whether you trust institutions. And then there's this worldview of a younger, more disaffected, and increasingly diverse new entrant. So here's the core point. There's two broad segments. The majority segment, longstanding Republicans who have backed the party for many years, are consistently conservative on economic questions, foreign policy, social issues. They favor low taxes. They take a hawkish view of China. They remain firmly pro-Israel. And they're highly skeptical of progressive agendas on transgender and DEI issues. But there is this sizable minority, 1/3 relative to the 2/3 that is essentially the core Republican group. The smaller minority is what I call the new entrants to the GOP coalition. They've come over the last two presidential cycles, and they're markedly different. They're younger. They're more racially diverse. They're more likely to have voted for Democratic candidates in the recent past. And this group diverges sharply from the party's core. They are also more likely, often substantially more likely, to hold progressive views on economic policy, on being more favorable toward China, more critical of Israel, more liberal, even on social and cultural issues, ranging from migration to DEI initiatives. And a significant share of that new entrant group also reports being openly racist or anti Semitic in some way, shape, or form. They express potential support for political violence, and yet they overwhelmingly identify as Republicans today in the here and now, and they voted for Donald Trump in 2024.
Okay, so we are not going to get into a methodological brouhaha on all of this, but I just want to stipulate that I have polling nerd friends who don't like text to web panels and all that kind of stuff. And this is not singling you out because they're used by all sorts of people all the time. These are the tools that people have. So I just want to stipulate, I don't think you'll disagree, but if you do, feel free to say so, that, one, it's a poll, it's a snapshot, as all polls are. Two, there are flaws in any polling methodology, including in this, but we're going to assume, for the sake of argument, that even if the exact numbers, 17%, not 18, not 16, whatever, even if the exact numbers are there's probably given them, there's certainly, even, everybody's got a margin of error. We're going to just assume that they're directionally right for the point of the conversation, right? Which I think is the only thing you can do. Otherwise, I wouldn't have you on, because either we would just going nuts on crazy number arguments, and then what would be the point of that? I failed my polling statistics class in college, so actually I just got a C. I should be clear about that because I did pass.
Jonah, quickly on methodological factors,
Sure.
if you'll allow me.
Sure.
It's really important to do multimodal polling in this day and age, meaning you still have those phone call respondents to ensure you're getting the older folks who vote the most in elections. And there are concerns with online panel polling through providers, but text to web is becoming a really important part of the process, meaning someone gets a text message that says, here, come fill out this poll, even maybe provide an incentive for you to fill out the poll so you're not, and we have speed checks throughout a poll, right? So you'll encounter a message along the way that says, click C if you're still paying attention. These are things we account for all the way around, but you are right to be dubious of the polling industry writ large, and everybody's kind of talking with each other about who's doing it right, who's got the best secret sauce, who does the weighting on the back end in the way that makes the most sense. But here's what I'll say about our polls, which I think is true of pretty much everybody's polls. They are not predictive almost ever. They are snapshots in time. And they are not even particularly great snapshots in time. They are often blurry snapshots you take as a selfie on your phone at a party. But that's not to say that they are useless. I'll preview with you now and say that we have a focus group transcript that we'll be releasing at City Journal soon in the coming weeks, where we went and spoke to an audience of voters that will be really relevant to some of the items we're talking about in this poll. And we'll run that. And that's kind of like a qualitative piece to accompany the quantitative piece.
Mm-hmm.
And the truth gets teased out somewhere in between all of those things. But polling, generally, you use it to observe trend lines. You don't say this is base truth objectively. Because this poll says X, then therefore X is true.
Right.
No, it's because this poll says X. What does that tell us about our politics and where things are going? Trend lines in polling are a lot more useful than numbers from any one individual poll.
Yeah, and it's also why, and again, this has nothing to do about your poll in particular, but issue polling has got a lot of bullshit to it insofar as, like, first of all, you ask leading questions, all this kind of stuff. Also, the corporate clients for issue polling, who really cares if it's 62% versus 68% like the word sunshine more than they like the word Queen Astray? I mean, the margin of error, the directional stuff all really matters. But issue polling with politics, there's so much social desirability bias. There's so much, um, you know, uh, you know, depends almost entirely on the phrasing of the questions. Like you can ask questions about welfare policy that can get wildly right wing answers or wildly left wing answers just based on the adjectives that you use. So just a caveat, I mean, about all of these things. But I wouldn't, if I didn't think the thing was useful, I wouldn't have asked you to come on here. So
there are three polls that are often in the marketplace today. You see polls that are put out through media companies, which are often what you're describing, right? There's social desirability bias part creeps in. It's just, we're going to put out a fast poll reacting to whatever's in the news lately, and just ask a quick question about it and then get it out to the masses. Those are coming out from media a lot of the time, big outlets that have the money to poll. Then there's polling that comes from traditional firms, Republican or Democratic ones, that somebody paid for. A little bit they ask sometimes thought leadership stuff that they get. They sell off individual questions on like a larger omnibus survey that they ask on some kind of regularized basis. So they get to do a little bit of the thought leadership stuff that brings in business. But for the most part, when you see a poll that's coming from a pollster, somebody paid for that poll. And then there's a third category, which I guess we kind of fit into, but there is like think tank polling or independent actors that are nonprofit motivated trying to seek out questions. It's typically very academic. It's typically very dry. It's typically trying to develop theories of the cases for academic studies. Okay. What we do with our polling is actually a little bit distinct from all three of those categories. It is kind of like how a political pollster or a media agency might approach polling, but it is based on policy ideas. It's kind of like almost like a policy message testing, right? So we're not trying to just sell one specific agenda. Actually, I think there are a lot of smart people on the left who have done a really good job of this over the years. There's Rui Teixeira, one of your AEI colleagues, who does stuff through Blueprint. There is David Shore, who is a smart progressive pollster who digs into policy questions. I think his firm today is called Blue Rose. There was Data for Progress a couple of years ago that was doing really super interesting stuff and kind of was at the peak of their powers and really influential within the Democratic Party shortly after President Biden took office. A guy named Sean McElway was running that project at the time. I think in some ways, those projects on the left are the best analog for the kinds of policy message testing polling that we're doing today at the Manhattan Institute.
Okay. And we should just throw in a fourth one, which would be things like the General Social Survey, which is this 800-pound gorilla that is done by the University of Chicago and Newark. But all right, anyway, all that aside, I did not, like, no offense to you, very smart, interesting answers. If I was going to have a podcast about polling methodology, it would offend many of my polling nerd friends that I picked you instead of them to do it. So, like, all the caveats stipulated. Let's get the conversation going by putting it this way. You spent a lot of time thinking about writing about whether or not the Trump coalition is replicable. I will just simply make an assertion and then you can caveat it, rebut it, endorse it in any way that you like. I think it is blazingly frigging obvious that you cannot replicate the Trump coalition. I say this once a week on some podcast that the mistake a lot of pundits like me made in 2015 and 2016 is we all said, oh, the laws of political gravity are going to, won't be repealed, and eventually Trump will come back down to earth. And what we missed was that he's not subject to the laws of political gravity. He's subject to the laws of celebrity gravity, which is just a very different kind of quantum physics, right? It's from the quantum realm. Weird stuff happens. It violates the EPR doctrine, all sorts of stuff, right? And we've seen time and time again that the coalition that will get together for Trump will not, chunks of it can be replicated for other politicians, but he is popular with people that conventional Republican politicians, that he's popular with people that are not popular, that conventional Republican politicians are not popular with. And the Trump coalition I think the Trump coalition is different than the MAGA coalition. I think it's different than the Republican coalition. Obviously, there are Venn diagrams that overlap, but the point of intersection is Donald Trump. And the idea that he can just hand the keys off of his coalition to JD Vance or anybody else, I just find transparently, obviously incorrect. In
Why do
part
you
because
think
that's
the
true with
Trump
almost every
coalition is
presidential
different from the
coalition.
MAGA coalition?
I'm sorry?
Why do you think the Trump coalition is different from the MAGA coalition?
Because I think, well, I mean, let's put it this way. Um, there are people out there. I don't know the numbers, right? Obviously, but and you can play logic jockeying games and say, well, it depends what you mean by MAGA. If what you mean by MAGA is just whatever Trump says, then there is no difference, right? But there are people in the sort of Mar-a-Lago universe who are basically liberal Democrat types, don't like the way Trump talks about various things, but they just love Trump, or they, for more pecuniary reasons, are all in on Trump. Some people just find the guy incredibly entertaining, but don't agree with big chunks of what I think most honest observers would call the MAGA agenda per se, but weren't necessarily, hardcore Republican voters either. I just think that he is as a cult of personality figure in American politics. The coalition that is going to coalesce around that personality is going to be sui generis, and much the same way, and also just like party coalitions are pretty fluid anyway. Barack Obama had a cult of personality. There were people who were willing to vote for Barack Obama who were not willing to vote for other Democrats, um, and and so I just think there are other reasons why I don't think that coalition can be transferred, because after a dozen years of him being the most important, talked about person in American politics, Trump fatigue is a real thing, including among real Trump fans. And the idea that you can just turn back on the enthusiasm for JD Vance or for anybody else, I think is fantasy. But anyway, that's my bold statement of conviction. Feel free to tear it apart, say it's overstated, do whatever you like.
I think you're broadly right. I mean, I think that Ronald Reagan clearly brought Reagan Democrats into the Republican Party based on a coalition that was anchored around an ideology. And what President Trump has done um, is a successful political project, but part of its appeal may actually be in its flexibility on
Mm-hmm.
policy questions. I think one of the most lasting elements of President Trump's political project may be how he rewrote the Republican Party's relationship with the abortion issue. In 2024, when parts of the Republican National Committee were coming together at the convention to write what the platform of the GOP would look like, they locked everybody's phones in a box, and the Trump political people came in and said, here's how we're going to do this. We're going to emphasize illegal immigration. We're going to emphasize critical race theory. We're going to emphasize pediatric gender medicine interventions. And we are going to put the cultural force behind the issues on which the public and the culture is with us. And we're going to talk about abortion a little bit differently than we have previously. And we're going to rewrite those lines. And we're going to take out some language around gay marriage that has been in the policy committee work product for the Republican National Committee when they gather at this convention for a long time. That is policy innovation. Yes, Donald Trump's views on an issue like criminal justice reform were different in the first term when they were organizing around the First Step Act than they are today when we're deploying the National Guard to American cities to restore order. But I will say, as now a resident of Washington, D.C., who also spends a lot of time in New York City, I quite like having the National Guard at my doorstep. There is a measurable improvement in my quality of life and some of the characters I encounter when I walk down the street since these folks have been deployed. And I feel only more grateful for them and their presence following the news of this shooting aimed at guardsmen just a couple of weeks ago. So all of that is to say that, yeah, you have to choose what your coalition is going to look like. And it may not be possible. In fact, I would agree with you. I would say it will be near impossible to maintain the Trump coalition exactly as he designed it once he exits the political stage. And a lot of these characters are now feuding with each other. This is one of the great insights, I think, of our survey, is that the faction of the party that is a bit more paranoid, a bit more concerned about so-called conspiracy theories, more likely to believe some of those ideas, doesn't subscribe to a coherent ideological policy program. That is why it is hard if you've got people with schizophrenic ideas, or maybe they're not even ideas, just schizophrenic tendencies and an approach to politics that is rewarded by what the algorithm rewards, right? What generates clicks that are coming from well outside the American right, and sometimes well outside of America.
Right.
You're going to have a different incentive structure in place than if you are, say, a Republican running for the presidential nomination in 2028.
So, I don't want a big argument about the National Guard stuff. It does not shock me at all that you bring in a bunch of National Guardsmen into a city, that crime will go down. I don't think it's the highest, best use of their time to be doing beautification stuff on the mall.
Broken windows policing.
Yeah, well, it's broken windows policing, except if once the Guard goes away, if you've done nothing to reform your actual policing, then it's just a sugar high, statistically.
Agreed there.
And, he has specific constitutional authorities to put troops in D.C., and I fully acknowledge that. And look, I live in D.C. I grew up in New York. I very tough on crime. Been writing about, broken windows stuff for 30 years. But he doesn't have the constitutional authority to do it in other cities, and he tests it. And I don't particularly like the compartmentalizing arguments about Trump's testing of the Constitution and the rule of law. I see them more, before we talked about poll numbers. If you look at them as trends, that's more important than any one snapshot. Looking at any one of these instances with Trump tends to obscure the fact that the trends are less defensible than maybe the individual snapshot policy stuff. But so let me ask you this, though. I think, and I've been saying this for a while, that Vance's apparent, because I don't know what his real thinking is, but Vance's apparent theory that he needs to straddle, equivocate, provide some cover for, I think what you in the poll calls it, the anti-Jewish Republicans, right? That he needs to sort of defend or distract or deflect from attacks on people making gross Holocaust jokes and whatnot in private texts and all that kind of stuff, because he in some respects sees that slice of the GOP as part of his constituency. I think that theory of the case is politically wrong. I think it's a miscalculation on his part, but I also find it very worrisome that he doesn't see it that way. That he thinks that, I don't think he supports Nick Fuentes, but I think he supports the idea that having Nick Fuentes as part of a broader conversation of democracy, blah, 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 is a viable political position for himself. And I think that's wrong, but the fact that he doesn't think it's wrong worries me about the direction that he would take the GOP. First of all, do you think his theory of the case, first of all, do you think I'm right about his theory of the case? And second of all, do you think that theory of the case, that his thinking about this has actually been politically prudent? You can leave the morality out of it or bring it in, I don't care, but I'm just kind of interested on the raw politics of it.
I don't think your theory of the case is exactly right. But let me actually go back to the National Guard stuff just for a quick second, not to talk about the National Guard, but to talk about these questions of norms and constitutionality. George Will wrote a column in the Washington Post, actually a couple of columns over the last few months, and a lot of people in corners to the right have been talking about these Venezuela strikes, okay, and whether or not Trump has the authority to go about this the way they're doing this, whether or not what the Secretary of War, whether he may or may not have been in the room, whether something akin to double tapping was going on. I am not an expert on the ethics of war, but I am someone who polls a lot of things and pays attention to political coalitions. It gets complicated when you've got one faction of a party that is sort of trying to make the case for a more hawkish disposition and worldview, a clear articulation of the fact that there are good guys and bad guys all over the world. And it's better for America to lead the good guys and win. When we're also splitting hairs over how some of those fights are executed. And I do not want to go down a rabbit hole about these specific strikes in Venezuela, but I'm only making a broader point about the kind of coalitional commentary, right? Like, if this is a mistake that the other side never makes, and it's not to say that, like, we shouldn't care about these technicalities. Obviously, they are very important. But I also think giving an administration credit where it's due for executing on sort of a, what Walter Russell Mead might categorize as a Jacksonian foreign policy that says screw with America and you will find out. I mean, this is how President Trump sold to his base the strikes on the Iranian nuclear sites, and why Tucker Carlson and figures like him failed in their attempt to coax the president out of doing that by fanning the flames of panic, doing what the president, earned them the nickname. The president gave them the nickname of Panicans because they were fanning the flames of panic and saying this would all contribute to World War III, which it obviously did not. And the president said, there's a country in the Middle East. They tell us they hate us and they want to destroy us. I am telling them they have to stop building a nuclear weapon, or I will stop it for them. And he did that. And the polling evidenced the fact that the president had total support from his political base in doing so. So then, to get more squarely to your point on Vance, right? I think we've agreed on the proposition that it will be very difficult for anybody who is not Donald Trump to stitch together the exact same coalition that Donald Trump managed to stitch together in 2024. I did a podcast and stream with the writer Richard Hanania just a few weeks ago, and he's out there. He's got some different ideas. I think these days, it wouldn't even be crazy to suggest that he's probably more center left than center right. But he voted for the same guy who I voted for, who is the same guy who Tucker Carlson voted for, who is the same guy who Dave Portnoy voted for in 2024. That won't happen again, most likely. So the question, and by the way, who RFK Jr. voted for, who doesn't care maybe about some of these same questions, but has different ideas about health and medicine. So all of that is to say, the coalition, creative political entrepreneurs are the ones who stitch together winning coalitions that capture the presidency. If Gavin Newsom doesn't allow himself to be pinned down by questions of whether he's a progressive or a moderate, but instead just talks a little bit less about woke stuff. And when he's asked, it's funny, Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, who's very popular and makes a lot of sense as a presidential contender on paper, in the same way Ron DeSantis did, in a swingier state, really high approval ratings from members of both parties, picking the right fights. When he gets asked about Zohran Mamdani or the far left, Shapiro sort of says, well, I gave, this was in one of the New York Times or Atlantic big profiles on Shapiro. Shapiro says, well, I gave him a phone call over the summer when the boot of the NYPD on your neck means it was laced by the IDF comments came out from Mamdani, and when the stuff about globalizing the Intifada, he refused to condemn it. I gave him a call and I said I didn't like that very much, but I'm wishing him the best of success as the next mayor of New York City. Okay, that's one way to answer that question. The other way to answer that question is the way Gavin Newsom does when he's asked it. Donald Trump is the biggest socialist in America. That's all I care about right now. Look at those tariffs and look at our economy. I think, regardless of what I think Josh Pirro is probably a better governor than Gavin Newsom is, but I think Gavin Newsom gave the better answer and is more likely to produce a more winning coalition based on that answer. Vance specifically, we'll see. I think this is a guy who is pro-Israel. He has articulated a vision of being pro-Israel that isn't anchored in being a hawk who fights for the good guys in every corner of the world. He's articulated a pro-Israelism that is more rooted in respect and admiration for Israel's religiosity, border security, demographic vigilance, natalism, all important aspects of the Israeli identity and culture. And I don't know, I'm maybe okay with that being the case that we make it. Maybe it's a smarter case. Israel is a very powerful country. Israel can do things on its own. Israel is a rich country. I don't know. I mean, I don't think that Israel can afford to lose all support in both parties. So they're going to have to choose how they make their arguments to the right. And Christian Zionists are still a massively influential and important voting bloc and will be block in the Republican primary nominating contest in 2028. But the arguments for a new generation of conservatives about why we should be pro-Israel, whatever, just may need to look a little bit different, may need to look a little bit more like the ones JD Vance has made.
Okay. So there's a lot going on in that answer. First of all, we'll just stipulate we disagree pretty profoundly about the Venezuela stuff. I'm not exactly sure what your position is, but the thrust of it, we talk about it just technicalities and talking about it in terms of coalitional interests and all of these kinds of things. Either he has the constitution, in my mind, either he has the constitutional authority to do what he's doing, or he's murdering people. And there's room for some gray area, not a lot. And having the commander in chief talking about the enemy within, I think is and saying that the real dangers of this country are people who disagree with me in the other party is kind of morally grotesque and dangerous, and gives a permission structure that we don't want in our politics, regardless of whether it's good for coalition building, and is particularly problematic in the context of his constant testing of constitutional norms that I don't think are trivial niceties. And the fact that Democrats think they're trivial niceties is not a standard that I think that conservatives should have. I don't have a huge rooting interest in Republicans anymore, but I am a conservative, and saying we have to live down to the standards of the people that we say we condemn for not having the proper standards is not an intellectually compelling argument to me. On the question of Vance that I asked you, I was basically not whether he's pro-Israel or not. I don't know if he's pro-Israel. I think I've heard answers from him that are profoundly, grotesquely anti-Israel, if you actually pay attention to the details of them when he talks to like TPUSA kids. And I've heard answers from him that are very pro-Israel. He's a politician who I don't trust, and he says different things to different audiences. That is not a new thing in politics. My question was, do you think it is a smart political move on Vance's part to be running political cover for sort of Groyper adjacent, Fuentes adjacent, anti-Israel, anti-Semitic people within the GOP, which I think he has done, and we can do the chapter and verse about my examples of this, but I think you know what they are. Is that politically wise going forward to build whatever coalition he needs to win? Because here's how I view it, is the more you embrace Nick Fuentes types, who I've long thought was kind of an astroturf fiction, and now there's been some new data out that suggests I was right. But I still think we live in a country that for every voter you gain by playing footsie with neo-Nazis, you probably lose 2 or 3.
Sure.
And that the people who say, "Oh, we need these people," who, according to your survey, are newcomers in the coalition to begin the party to begin with. If we lose, if we need to embrace what I would argue are immoral, but also politically inadvisable positions in order to pick these people up, to me, it is like the guy who says, sure, we lose money on every sale, but we can make it up in volume. And so that's the reason. I mean, again, I have all sorts of moral and intellectual problems with what Vance is doing, but what I find troubling is that he thinks it's smart. And I think Vance is very smart, and I think he's got very smart people around him. And so it could be one of the things that makes doing political analysis and psephology in the Trump era is that it's always been a factor in every presidency, but never remotely as much in this one, in the ways that politicians are forced to pander to a constituency of one, that makes it really hard to figure out whether they're doing something because they think it's a smart political move for coalition building, or whether they think they're going to get fired from their cabinet position or like get a mean tweet about them from Trump if they don't say things the way that he likes to hear them. And it puts more criminology and less political science into the sort of business of analyzing this stuff.
Yeah. I think there are a lot of different ways you could build a GOP coalition that could win again in 2028 or 2032. Look, with respect to the Groypers and Fuentes adjacent people, I am obviously not one of them. But I think that a lot of people who will tell you they have a favorable view of Tucker Carlson, or maybe even that they have a favorable view of Nick Fuentes, do not want to see Jews they know in their life sent to a gas chamber or something like that. There is a strange thing going on in our politics right now. It's a form of brain rot that has permeated our politics as well. A lot of people are just sort of looking for a good time. They are listening to ambient background sound in the form of podcasts that come from Candace Owens or Tucker Carlson, and they are engaging with it the way they maybe engage with the National Enquirer. They peruse it while waiting in line at the grocery store. They don't necessarily take everything they read there to be true, but maybe there are kernels of sort of vibe-based truths there. I think that is the lesson of Donald Trump. The Republican Party went back to the drawing board after 2012 and developed an autopsy of what they thought would make them more normal and broaden their appeal. It turns out Donald Trump, from hanging out with Howard Stern and showing up at WWE fights, had a better sense of what was normal in America and what would appeal to independents. Now, there are different versions of normal. You can stitch together a majority coalition in all sorts of different ways. And the truth is, with a two-party system and all of the kind of distorting effects that make our politics really, really weird as a result of a two-party system, you don't even necessarily need to get majority support. You can just be less weird and bad than the other guy. So we'll have to see. I don't know that J.D. Vance knows what his coalition is going to look like yet in 2028. And I don't know. Maybe he's smarter for taking a wait-and-see approach. But you are obviously, I just want to confirm the obvious here and not equivocate. Nazis are bad, Nick Fuentes is bad, and he has terrible ideas. But we should also try and understand why these people are popular. And I think it does go back, and, the left has done bad things. They have called John McCain a racist. They have called Mitt Romney a racist. They have called Donald Trump a racist, anti-Semitic bigot. And they've said the same about you, Jonah, and they've said the same about Ben Shapiro. Okay? So when a young kid living in a red state, somewhat rural, is Gen Z, is in his 20s now, has only heard those things about normal Republican politicians for his entire political upbringing in life, When we clutch our pearls and simply scream from the mountaintops, Tucker Carlson, who used to have the primetime slot on Fox News, is just racist. Don't listen to him. Or there's this guy that's showing up in your Instagram Reels feed constantly who is sort of a loser and a strange kid in his basement who just is funny and sort of making race jokes all the time. You cannot listen to him. He is a racist. It needs to be banned from our politics in total existence. I just don't think that's how we win it when it comes to beating these guys. I agree with you about the importance of defeating these guys. I agree with you about the toxicity of the ideas that they're bringing to the table. But I'm simply thinking about how it is we beat them. And I think that we've got to call them out for what they are, which is they are responsive to a different set of incentives, many of which are coming from far outside the mainstream American right. And like I said earlier in the podcast, also are coming because of these platforms where they make their money from far outside of America a lot of the time too.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of truth there. I think there are important lines that one could draw. I think the way the Heritage Foundation handled all of this has been very, very, very bad. Been a think tank guy for a very long time, known a lot of people at Heritage, been at AI a long time, known a lot of people at Manhattan Institute, going way back. I think turning think tanks into appendages of political parties, never mind of, very online hosts, is just a bad policy. And I think that but at the same time, I hear what you're saying. Look, I wrote a whole book called Liberal Fascism because I got so sick of hearing.
I think it might be back there somewhere, to be honest with you.
It's possible. And one of the impetuses for it was people telling me that people who had the views that my father had were fascists, and I was like, wait a second. And so I'm very familiar with the phenomenon. My objections to Tucker, who I've now known for going on 30 something years, is not that he's a racist. I thought that New York Times big profile that they did was a really wasted opportunity because they thought it was, if they could just convince people abracadabra that Tucker's racist, that would be the end of Tucker. And I was like, that card is kind of played. This is not to say that I like all the racist things that Tucker has said, and I think that's a perfectly valid line of criticism for somebody else to take at him. My bigger problem with Tucker is that he lies. And I think that like the one thing I think that is essential to journalism and intellectual affairs is telling the truth. That doesn't mean you have to always be right. You can always change your opinion with new facts or whatever, but don't say or write things that you do not believe to be true. And I get following Fuentes as a form of entertainment, sort of, Alex Jones, but in with a German accent or whatever. Fine. But the shit that he says is not true. And acting, so here's where I have the problem, and this sort of the Fuentes thing is a good example of this, right? I think that part of the calculation that Vance is making is that he thinks the Fuentes type phenomenon is more real than it is. And when I say that includes Candace Owens, that includes Tucker Carlson, that includes all sorts of podcast bros that, I don't follow or care about. This administration and a lot of the young people, I mean, it's so funny. 10 years ago, every smart conservative I knew criticizing the left would say, these young activists, they're way too online. They're way too invested in Twitter because Twitter used to be left-wing, right? Or left-wing skewed. And they think Twitter's the real world and blah, 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 blah. And now virtually all of the young Republicans, sort of the cadres of staffers in Washington, are way too online and think Twitter is real. Capitol Hill is full of young staffers, particularly comms people, who think that that doing comm stuff is just dropping, sick burns on, journalists and Democrats, and that my day is done. Did you see my meme? And there are lots of people who don't even know how to do legislation anymore. And I think that there are a lot of people in this White House, and there are a lot of people in the GOP these days who think these new entrants that you're talking about, who are very online, right, and who have a very online language and worldview, represent the real GOP. And one of the reasons I want to have you on is that the part of the takeaway from your survey is that the overwhelming majority of the GOP are fairly normie Republicans. And so, thinking that Twitter, if Twitter is sort of like the shadows on the walls of Plato's cave and that it's the real world, you're going to make decisions, political decisions, based on Twitter reactions, which maybe isn't all that smart, because out in the real world, normal Republicans and Americans generally are much more pro-Israel than you'll get in the online world, and they're much more pro, election and democracy, and they don't necessarily believe all these conspiracy theories. But the people who living their lives mediated through screens are not the median voter or even the median Republican. And that's sort of what I'm getting at, is that I think that this online Groyper and Groyper adjacent phenomenon is pretty astroturfy. It's pretty thin in the real world. But if you think it's real, you start making decisions based upon the mirage rather than the reality, and that creates its own new reality.
The brain rot is real, but the worldview that's being a sort of, how shall I put this? The worldview that is being superimposed onto the new entrants is fake. Okay? So the most interesting thing about the new entrants is not that they're just more liberal than the core Republicans on every policy question. That is interesting. But it's that they're all over the place from each other. It's that they're ping-ponging. They're all over the map. They don't subscribe to a cohesive policy identity. And what you're seeing a lot of hyper policy-focused operators in Washington do is try to say, see, this is the Buchananite program that is the base truth, that it's just been elites after elites, and now it's even Trump and his army of elites that are trying to squash this Buchananite consensus that people own, okay? No, that's not right. And it's why, by the way, Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens and people like that are experiencing success right now, I think, is because the one part where I will disagree with you is that, like, conspiracies are kind of popular. Not quite majoritarian popular, but the idea that people are lying to you and that you shouldn't believe everything you're told, that does have a lot of purchase.
Oh, I agree with that entirely.
Yeah.
I have theories why, but yeah.
And then there's one thing that is worth clarifying that may not be as obvious to people who don't spend as much time on the internet as, unfortunately, I do, which is that a lot of these people we've been talking about are paranoid schizophrenics who will take any given side of any given issue, depending on where the incentives come from online, and can flexibly switch positions within those channels based on where they need to be on any given day. Nick Fuentes, is someone who I think subscribes to a coherent policy worldview and perhaps possesses rhetorical, oratory, comedic talents that many of these others do not. And that is a dangerous combination. In a piece that I wrote after, or actually, I'm sorry, this was a piece that came out shortly before the poll, where I talked about an interview that Ezra Klein did with a guy named John Gans about the Fuentes phenomenon. And I thought John Gans, who is on the left and inconsistent in his condemnation of anti-Semitism, was a really bad person to bring on to talk about anti-Semitism on the right for those obvious reasons. But beyond that, I talked about Fuentes, and I wrote about a monologue Fuentes gave the other night, where he talks about a way in which he envisions the right could work with the left. A very clear and very coherent articulation of a sort of unifying, if you're thinking about horseshoe theory, bottom end of the horseshoe ideology. You know, if you can get that horseshoe to extend up far enough within the Democratic Party or within the Republican Party, then you start have to worry about losing a real coalitional fight to the bad guys. I'm less worried about it though because of the stuff we talked about before. Well, Fuentes himself may be someone with actually a serious cohesive ideology that is very dangerous. The people from which he is trying to pull in do not, and they fight with each other all the time, and they're manic. They're like Marjorie Taylor Greene. That's the best they kind of tend to do in our politics typically. Donald Trump should not be confused as that. Donald Trump is a guy who's moderated the GOP on all sorts of policy questions in interesting ways. And I think he represents something very different, much more cosmopolitan, and much more normal, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, look, I think there is a case to be made. Rich Lowry makes this case often that a lot of Trump's decisions are actually more normie Republican than people can see because he implements and defends them in abnormal ways. And so he puts rhetoric and spin on it that makes it seem like it's wildly norm defying, but actually it's kind of, some of these things are kind of middle of the road sort of. I mean, I think one of the things that I'm sort of obsessed with of late is Nixon erasure. And Nixon was the last liberal Republican president. He was a New Dealer essentially. Created vast swaths of programs that we tend to associate with Democrats and the Great Society, starting, he's the guy who created the EPA. He's the one who really put teeth to affirmative action. He did wages and price controls. You can go down a very long list of action items. And in part because Reagan didn't want to talk about Watergate, he didn't talk about Nixon very much at all either. And so Reagan comes in and everyone thinks that Republicans have always been these right-wing creatures when, it's in my lifetime that this has basically been true. And there's a lot of Nixon in the Trump administration. Nixon was a big violator of norms too. He did the Nixon shock was economically crazy, and these tariffs, I think, are economically crazy. But one of the problems, like if you study the history of the New Deal, it's amazing how many people get called right wing because they don't like FDR. And it doesn't matter why they don't like FDR. It's just simply not liking FDR means you're right wing. So Father Coughlin, who had a lot of left wing positions on economics, is considered sort of the poster child of a right-wing critic of FDR, even though he supported FDR in 1932, saying that New Deal was Christ's deal. I think similarly, we get a politics these days where if you criticize Donald Trump, and I think Fox deserves a lot of blame for this, but if you criticize Donald Trump, you get called a left-winger or a squish or a rhino. A big chunk of my criticism of Donald Trump are from the right? And I try to explain to people, he made, you're absolutely right, he moderated the GOP. The GOP, we now have two functionally pro-choice parties in this country because of Donald Trump. One is much more pro-choice than the other, right? There are lots of room in the Republican Party for, limitations and restrictions on abortion. But his whole point, sending it back to the states used to be considered, which was sort of my position all along, was considered a move to the middle and a violation of pro-life orthodoxy on the right. But Trump gets away with it because he's Trump, and no one seems to notice that, like, you can call Zoran Mandami a socialist all day long. I'm perfectly happy to do so. I just very difficult to take from people who are talking about buying equity shares, the federal government buying equity shares in hosts of corporations. That's a very left-wing thing. And if a Democratic president had done it, Republicans would point that out, but they can't now. And so I agree with you. There's a lot of churn and there are a lot of people who don't see what Trump is doing with clear eyes. That's another reason why I think what is to come is going to be very different than what we have seen.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of those normie Republicans who forgive Trump for doing left-wing things or crazy things, but they punish any other Republican politician who tries to imitate Trump. And I think there are a lot of Republican politicians who don't appreciate that.
Yeah, Trump imitation probably you could kind of coast by on that for a while Trump was in office, but once Trump leaves the political scene, the imitators, if they abound, they will not succeed. One thing you said about the economy and President Trump in particular really stuck with me. I think that, there was this interesting clip. I think it was from an interview with Dasha Burns. It may have been somebody else the other day.
The A plus 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 interview.
Exactly. That
Yeah.
was the grade Trump was asked to give when that was the grade Trump gave when asked about how his economy is
Mhm.
doing. Look, that didn't work for Joe Biden when he was
Right.
asked about the economy. But on the other hand, like one thing that's happened to me in the last 10 years, I'm 29 now. When I was 19, just coming out of college, or maybe even in the last 10 years, maybe even a little bit longer than that, is I've become a lot more socially conservative. And when I say that, I'm not talking about just my view on like abortion or gun rights or whatever, though that's probably true as well. What I am talking about is like, you talk to a lot of young conservatives today, and they'll tell you, yeah, they're mad because their generation is economically screwed, or they're mad because they can't buy a house. But if you probe a bit further and you ask, like, how many of you want to buy a house right now? You don't hear overwhelming, like, yeah, 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 yeah,
Mhm.
because for the same reasons that like a lot of cosmopolitan people aren't ready to buy a house, because way more Gen Z people are single. Way more Gen Z people are less religiously observant. They are not they're not doing the things that led people from the generation before them to settle down and build homes and families much younger. And I think that is coming large part because they are addicted to their phones, and they are filled with grievance and anger, and envy. And that is creating, I think, a bit of a distorting effect where the impulse of a lot of people is to, just rush to whatever the latest trend is. It's Ezra Klein in abundance, or it's Zoran Mamdani in affordability. Um, but maybe it's like the culture is actually sicker, and what we really need is a sort of new socially conservative moment. John Haidt makes a lot of these arguments. I think he's spot on in them. One of my Manhattan Institute colleagues, Abigail Schreier, is writing a lot about young people and relationships and how they interact with each other and the problems associated with it. She's going to have a book on that soon, and I think that's really important as well. Um, but that's what I'm paying a lot of attention to. So it's like, actually, yeah, a lot of people are maybe okay economically. There was a discourse on Twitter several months ago pointing out the fact that you can go work at Panda Express in a fairly short amount of time and make a six-figure salary on a management track. But if you're looking at Instagram all day long and looking at influencers like Andrew Tate, who are telling you why that's not dignified, and why that's not dignified to have a six-figure manager job and live in a city that is not New York or LA, and have a family and have kids and have a wife who you love and respect and cherish and go to church regularly. If you're setting the bar for yourself as something much higher, and something higher that existed once before, but now you're being denied because of sinister actors at play, be they elites or be they Zionists or Jews or what have you. Well, that's just a lot easier, right? Because that's not self-implicating in any way. That's not saying that you have to go do something. But a lot of this may change when the boomers die, because we are going to see this massive generational transfer of wealth.
Mhm.
And then there's going to be a massive slice of people my age who don't get access to that wealth transfer. And they're going to want a piece of it, and they're going to want to take it. And that may be when realignment begins to ship a different way. Again, I think we're even seeing kernels of this in like the story about fraudsters out of Minnesota, largely coming from the Somali migrant community that my colleagues Chris Rufo and Ryan Thorpe from the Manhattan Institute reported on in City Journal, as well as many other great reporters around the country. Americans also like really hate unfairness. They hate welfare fraud, and they're even more deeply offended by it when it's being done by people for whom this country has extended generosity and opportunity to, coming from abroad, and they they didn't adopt like a pathway toward assimilation that would lead them to not do things like this. So I'm paying attention to that trend, and I think that fiscal conservatism, or if not fiscal conservatism, at least like late 90s Clinton era style welfare reform, some of these issues about fairness, they may make a comeback. I don't think we should take the Zohran Mamdani affordability message as like necessary evidence that all we have to be talking about all of the time is how to get Gen Z to buy homes, because I'm not convinced that a lot of these single irreligious Zoomers even would buy homes if they could.
Well, I think that's fair. At the same time, it is crazy that the average first-time home buying age is like 40 now, and 30 years ago it was like 28. Like there are other like I agree with you. Hipsters in New York and LA may be one thing, but there are a lot of people between those two poles. Look, my own theory about this is
A lot of young people outside of New York and LA struggling to find partners, struggling to settle down, getting married a lot later as well.
yeah, no, I agree. Look, I think you're directionally right on this. I think the way I've been talking about it for a while now is, we all know what a Veblen good is, right? Veblen is like conspicuous consumption. Look how great my car is. This shows how I can afford this car, kind of thing. Veblen goods are not necessarily positional goods, right? This is economist Fred Hirsch in the 1970s coined the term positional good, and positional good can come from being rich. Like there's only one Mona Lisa in the world. If I buy it, I have it and nobody else has it. But a lot of positional goods have more to do with status than they do with possession. And so being the best basketball player in your high school is a positional good. No one, if you are it, no one else can be it. Right. And Fred Hirsch argued, I'm not saying I entirely agree with him, but it's worth thinking about, that the rise in importance of positional goods, of status, is why America can no longer deliver the American dream, because the American dream is deliverable if all it is a bunch of material possessions. If what you really care about, and what people like Tate teach you, is that you need to be better than everybody else, you need to be higher status, you need to be, that the values of the attention economy determine whether you're living a meaningful and important life. That's an impossible standard. Not every single person can be a famous influencer, right? And not every person can be the most attractive person around. And it's the value shift towards positional goods of of status, or of thumos in the Greek sense, or this idea of being an alpha. It's like all of these very online bros all think that if they were alive in the Roman Empire days, they'd be some conquering general rather than some friggin' slave pulling wheat, right? And if you set those kinds of expectations for people, that living a good, decent, prosperous life where you find a partner and have a home and raise happy, well-adjusted kids, if that's not good enough, because everybody can do that, then you breed generational resentment. And I think the left has spent generations breeding resentment and grievance, and now the right spends a lot of time breeding resentment and grievance. And resentment and grievance do not fill the holes in your soul. What fills the hole in your soul is gratitude. And we don't teach people to be grateful for this country. Listen to Tucker all the time talking about how you feel ripped off and this country sucks. And that's the message that I have a problem with. And I think a lot of that message does come from Trump. Like when Trump's in charge, he says this country is friggin' awesome. The second he's not in charge, he says this country is the worst country in the world. I think this country is a pretty good country, regardless of which party temporarily occupies the White House.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that a success-oriented, optimistic politics, if we can return to it, would be phenomenally good for the country. I am hoping against all hope for a religious revival. I am hoping that the assassination of Charlie Kirk, who is a conservative who meant a tremendously great deal to my generation of Americans on the right, will help incept that. There's this town hall event through CBS News with Barry Weiss hosting a conversation with Charlie's widow, Erica Kirk, that will run Saturday night. I think it will prove a really instructive conversation. And I think Erica Kirk is one figure who is subject to a lot of hate right now and a lot of conspiratorial, bizarre vitriol. And in many ways, she may actually even be better suited as the corrective on some of this stuff than even her husband was, who debated policy minutiae and got into the nitty-gritty on all kinds of political questions. I have a feeling that with Erica Kirk at the helm of Turning Point USA, this emphasis on religious revival may become even more central to the organization. And I think if that is successful, it will be healthy for the country because it will provide an alternative. There's also this book that's going to be posthumously coming out. It's Charlie Kirk's last authored work, where he talks about the fact that he practiced a Jewish Sabbath for 25 hours each week and just got him off of his phone, which is a form of digital fentanyl, I think, in some ways. We disagreed about the Venezuela stuff to some extent, fentanyl being coming in the country, but this is digital.
There's no fentanyl coming from Venezuela, right? That's propaganda.
Fentanyl precursors or what have you, but
it's cocaine.
I digress.
Okay.
I digress. Yeah. This digital fentanyl piece with the phones is a huge deal, and if people can put them away for a little while and spend a little bit more time in church, with community, in a real life setting. A lot of people don't have a third place they go anymore other than home and work. A lot of people don't even have a second place they go anymore, with Zoomers not having to work in an office setting at all. If Erica Kirk, if Turning Point USA, if anyone else can be a force for instituting this kind of religious revival stuff, it'll be massively good for our politics as well.
Yeah, if that happens, I think it would be all to the better. I would like to make sure it's not. I mean, Turning Point USA is, essentially an adjunct of the GOP, and I find that the equating being a good Christian with being a good Republican, I find problematic in the same way that I find being a good Christian, being a good Democrat problematic. But if she can help in that regard, I think that would be great. I agree with you entirely on the phone stuff. It's funny, like I recorded a podcast earlier today with Rahm Emanuel, and I don't normally like to have politicians on here, but we talked a bunch about the Australian social media ban for kids, and whatever you think about it in terms of nanny state this or whatever that, it is shocking to me just talking to normie parents. It is one of these sort of transpartisan kind of issues, and I think Jonathan Haidt deserves a lot of the credit for it. He's not alone, but he's carried a lot of that water. I don't know if we can get it done here, but there are no major constitutional issues to my mind about age gating content for minors, because we've done that for 250 years and it's all past constitutional muster. But it is remarkable how many hardcore conservatives and hardcore progressives all like the general thrust of the idea, because they've all seen in their kids and in their friends these problems that you're talking about. And I'm extremely sympathetic to it. I'll wait for Shoshana from our street to yell at me about it before I make my final decision. But that's sort of where I come down on it.
Yeah. That's great that you talked to Rahm Emanuel. I'm super excited to listen to that episode. Rahm is totally right on this phone stuff, and I'm glad he's taking it up as an issue. Rahm's also right about an opportunity agenda that he's talking about. I think the problem he's going to run into is just that voters in the Democratic Party aren't sold on it. But yeah, maybe his presidential run, if he ends up doing one, will bring up some healthy conversations in a way that I think Michael Bloomberg's run in 2020, 2020?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 2020 was supposed to, but maybe, didn't end up doing. Bloomberg himself, never was an amazing debater and obviously ran as an older guy and, didn't make the impact on that race that many anticipated.
Hey, man, he won American Samoa. Which is just a huge win.
Yeah, what did he pay per vote?
I once knew the answer to that, and it was literally hundreds of millions of dollars or something like that.
No, but I'm a weird guy, man. I think Erica Kirk at the helm of TPUSA is a great thing for America, and I also think a Rahm Emanuel presidential run would probably be a good thing for America. And I'm
look, I mean, I come from originally. I come from my first job in Washington was working for Ben Wattenberg, who was a right-wing Democrat, Reagan Democrat guy. And so I had to go to school on all of this stuff about the previous efforts to pull the Democratic Party back to the center that happened first in the 70s and then with the DLC in the 80s. And Rahm is one of those guys, right? And I'm much more conservative than Rahm Emanuel, and we disagree on a whole bunch of stuff. But he's one of the only guys who's willing to punch left.
Yeah.
And it's funny. It's like I hear from people all the time, Rahm couldn't possibly move the Democratic Party left. It's too the groups are too entrenched. That's an argument about whether or not he can win the primary.
Move the party right, you mean?
Move the party right. Yeah. Sorry. And that's an argument. Most of their examples are about how it would be hard for him to win the primary, which I think it would be. I think, he would have a burden there. But I think there's one thing, sort of we were talking about before that Trump has proven is that when you win, it's amazing how quickly all the opposition caves. And how Trump said in an interview with the Washington Post in 2016 that winning solves a lot of problems. He was asked about the fractures inside the party, and he said, well, winning solves a lot and he was absolutely right about that. With very few exceptions, the major institutions of the right that had iron, from pro-lifers, the only ones he's never actually really tested in a significant way are the gun control people, are the gun rights people.
He tiptoed there.
He did. He got up to the water's edge and then came back.
Yeah.
First get the guns in that cabinet meeting or whatever, but and I think I saw it with Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton moved the party to the right. I had big problems with Bill Clinton, but the left had spent the previous 15 years building up this entire argument about sexual harassment and disproportionate power between the sexes and all these things. And then Clinton becomes president of the United States and they all cave. And so I think if Rahm could get elected president, you would see the Democratic Party swing wildly rightward towards the center. I don't think it'll ever get fully, we don't expect it to. And then we'll be calling whatever Rahm does crazy left-wing things, because that's the stupidity of our politics, is that whatever the other team does is insane left-wing or insane right-wing. And
well, I should be clear. I assume if Rahm Emanuel became president, he would probably do a lot of very left-wing things I wouldn't like that much.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah. No, sure.
But probably less so than Alexandria Ocasio.
Yeah, but compared to what Bernie Sanders would do, it's corporate liberalism. He's not a socialist. He's like a big state, progressive guy.
Yeah, he's an Obama. He was the Obama guy. So it's crazy how the Obama guy just feels so different and so moderate today. You mentioned Ben Wattenberg, your first boss in Washington. Mm-hmm. I didn't know that. That's awesome. I'm just starting his book with
Bill Salmon.
Richard, Scammon on the Real Majority, and I think there are some lessons there that are very instructive to our current moment. That book, I believe, also came out sort of in tandem with a book by a Republican political operative at the same time, Kevin Phillips. The Emerging Republican Majority. And
so if you want,
it's like they're both right in many ways.
For sure.
But
who thought right, so?
But everything that's happening right now is like some like the bad trends today are like very anti what the message of both of those books was.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's fair. That's interesting. Just for political trivia, so The Real America, or there's The Real Majority was the first one, right? Ben and Richard Scammon wrote it. That is where the term social issue was first introduced into the American political lexicon. And that and the Kevin Phillips book, was it The Emerging Republican Majority, something
Yeah,
like
I
that?
believe so, yeah.
The Ben and Richard wrote The Real Majority as an effort to convince Democrats to move to the center. They were party Democrats, all that kind of stuff, and the Democrats completely ignored it. But there was this junior aide in the Nixon White House named Pat Buchanan who read it and said, "This is exactly what we need to do." And that is what, if memory serves, fueled a lot of like the real majority, or silent majority stuff from the Nixon people. And they wanted, radical centrists and all this stuff that gets us into Sam Francis, which we don't need to do. But anyway, it's a great. It's sort of like Roy Teixeira and John Judas coming out with that book about, the coalition of the ascendant or whatever, and everybody reading the press release rather than the book and thinking that demography is destiny, and we can now because we have non-white people in the bag, we can just crap all over the white working class. And Rui Teixeira is like, that's not what I said in the book. We need the white working class to stay to be a majority. And Democrats believe the hype. I got Rahm to admit that he made a mistake in believing the hype on all of that. And you saw tens of millions of white working class dudes and black and Hispanic working class dudes leave the Democratic Party and join the Republican Party when everyone said that this was baked into a cake generationally, and the Democrats can be the majority party forever. Don't necessarily, like, books can be really smart, but you actually have to read them and you actually have to
Exactly.
apply them correctly. But
yeah,
anyway.
exactly. And now those new entrants to the GOP are reshaping our coalition, and some of our ideological tendencies. And we'll have to make a decision about come 2028, or if we lose, come 2032, what kind of coalition, what kind of party, and above all else, what kind of movement we want to be.
Yeah, I mean, stipulated, I'll just say that I don't use we and our about any of this anymore. I did it for a very long time. I care very much about being a conservative. I really couldn't give a rat's ass about calling myself a Republican anymore, but that's my bag.
I should stipulate the same. I mean, I'm certainly on the American right, and I'm a conservative in a professional capacity and a Republican in just a personal capacity. But so when I say we, I guess I just mean anybody who falls right of center.
Fair enough. All right, Jesse Arm, thank you so much for doing this. Appreciate it, and I hope you come back. Let me know when you get that book done.